Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so picking back up with the Fantastic Four again, it's been a little while since we covered Fantastic Four. Honestly, the first arc, I think we maybe did half of it. The first arc is everybody coming back, and the part that we didn't do was Ben Grimm basically getting married to like Alicia Masters. It was kind of a cool little thing, but in all reality, it was only really relevant if you had been a fan of the Ben Grimm Alicia Masters relationship, which I mean, I guess was fine. I mean, it never really mattered to me too much. But the takeaway from that little tidbit is that at the end of that story, Galactus had basically arrived on Earth, right? And then like Dr. Doom had made this grandiose statement to the world that like he was going to be the one to save the world and all that kind of good stuff. And like that was it. That's kind of where that one left off. But in this one, it kind of actually like picks up with the main event itself, like with the actual conflict itself. Now, here's kind of the funny thing here. Galactus showing up on Earth is technically not supposed to happen. And the reason why is because during the original Galactus trilogy in the old Fantastic Four comics, right? Like the old Stan Lee, Jack Kirby comics, one of the first major cosmic events, or at least cosmic themed stories to pop up in Marvel. And even in subsequent stories, Galactus vowed never to return to Earth and consume it unless he was summoned by the Fantastic Four to like actually arrive at the planet. And the reason why was because in that original story, Reed Richards had managed to secure the Ultimate Nullifier, right? Which, as we know, or at least those of you guys who have heard our discussions on it know, the Ultimate Nullifier is basically a device that if it's pointed at somebody and someone's capable of using it to its full potential, it can like wipe out all existence, right? It can like destroy an entire universe. On a baseline level, it can destroy a singular being. Now, it is kind of an interesting thing because while it is a MacGuffin, more or less, it does create an interesting scenario because the last time that happened, that like Galactus died, not necessarily at the hands of the Nullifier, but the last time Galactus died, we got Abraxas. Now, this is one of those things where Dan Slott's probably kind of picking and choosing and it's being like, there was no Abraxas. And that's actually kind of fine because Abraxas was a cool concept, but he was never seen or heard from again after the original story that was told about him and never really even referenced again. So like, that's kind of that, right? I mean, it's just sort of out there and it's kind of a hand wavy thing and that's basically the end of that. But seeing Dr. Doom face off against Galactus is actually kind of a cool little moment because they've done this more than once, right? Like they've done this dance before. And this is something that I actually found kind of interesting because Dan Slott makes no reference to it. And the original Secret Wars in 1984, Dr. Doom actually stole the power of Galactus and then eventually stole the power of the Beyonder. So it's not the first time that Dr. Doom has done something like this, but it's also kind of a cool little moment because this is sort of a return to form for his character, right? For those of you guys who hadn't really followed Dr. Doom really in Marvel Comics in general, of course, he was a foe of the Fantastic Four and really even like the Avengers and X-Men and like the world for a long time, right? Like there was never really an instance where he had become a good guy. He had temporary alliances with superheroes, but he was never really like a full-on good guy. Now we go into like Secret Wars 2015, and that's when like Dr. Doom basically, you know, when the whole multiverse is destroyed and Dr. Doom uses the power of the Beyonders to save what he can and then holds it together. The way he was written was actually kind of a tormented character, right? Because it's like, on one hand, I saved everything that I could, but on the other hand, I acknowledge the fact that I'm not Reed Richards and he probably could have done it better. And that was the whole thing behind it, right? Like at the end of the Secret Wars story, it was finally the admission from Dr. Doom that Reed Richards is better than him. Now, coming out of that, Dr. Doom got a new lease on life, right? Like when Reed Richards basically fixed everything, set it all back, and then Marvel failed to reboot like they should have, we kind of got a continuation of everything that had happened before. And Dr. Doom basically went on to like try to become a good guy and then became a full-on good guy when like Tony Stark, when Iron Man died during Civil War II, and then he became the new like Iron Doom, right? Like, you know, the I can't remember exactly what his name was, but basically like he was the new superhero. And so like with that being the case, a new Iron Man and him going around and actually being, you know, a hero, even if he was only teetering on anti-hero levels, that was essentially it. But following like the collapse of all that, the end of all that, like his more or less defeat, he ended up retreating back to Latveria, and something basically happened that led him to be, you know, going back to being essentially a bad guy again. And it kind of sucks because he was cool as a good guy, but like like I've always told you guys in Marvel Comics, everything always goes back to the way it was before, right? That's the nature of comics. There's kind of a status quo that's created, things change, and then they go back, which is, again, why I never really understood, you know, why people complain about things changing, because it always goes back. It's like complaining about the fact that the sun went down. Well, yeah, I mean, it'll come up the next morning. So, I mean, you know, like it's kind of an interesting scenario. But again, with Doom facing off against Galactus, the reason why he's not just immediately wiped out and phased out of existence is because he's done this dance before. And so he kind of knows what to expect when someone like Galactus comes around. Now, of course, what he's also joined with is basically the Herald of Dr. Doom, Doom, a chick named Victorious. Now, Victorious showing up here is kind of interesting. We'll actually get an explanation here in a little bit, but she basically defeats the Fantastic Four pretty quickly. And that's one of the things to kind of bear in mind is depending on who's writing the Fantastic Four, either they are like incredibly powerful or they're relatively weak. They're never really in between. There's never really like a middle ground where they're pretty decent. Like they're pretty capable. Like that's never really done. It's always just kind of like, yeah, they're there and like they can be defeated pretty easily. Or it's like Johnny Storm losing his mind, going Nova and like basically equating the power of like a supernova and like destroying something. Like it's usually something along those lines. Like what you saw with Hickman's Fantastic Four, where like Susan Storm puts up a force field that can like shield her from the power of a celestial, or at least a bunch of celestials. It was temporary, but it still worked. And so with that in mind, of course, Johnny Storm is basically the only one who's really able to kind of go toe to toe with Victorious. And this is when we kind of get an explanation here that essentially what had happened is that following the whole end of like Dr. Doom being Iron Man and then retreating back to Latveria, that he just sort of existed there. But Latveria was in a state of not really a coup d'etat so much as well, I guess it kind of was a coup d'etat. It was the forces that were loyal to Latveria and Dr. Doom versus the forces that were trying to conquer it all. And so what ended up happening is, of course, like Victorious came along and said, hey, look, her name being Zora came along and said, hey, look, you've got like Dr. Doom, you have to go back and you have to restore order to Latveria, which he did. But because of the fact that she was kind of his champion, right? Like she was the one waving the banner and saying like, we all have to swear allegiance to Dr. Doom. He saw her as like his most loyal servant, like his most loyal citizen. And so because of that, what he ended up doing was creating a device that allowed him to tap in and harness the power cosmic and then in turn applied it to her. Now, a lot of people will ask the question, if Dr. Doom had the ability to harness and to endow someone with the power cosmic, why hasn't he done it for himself? And the reason why is because the way that Dr. Doom is written, it would be like a coward's way out. Dr. Doom prefers to rely on his own magic and his own powers, which admittedly are quite prodigious, right? I mean, he's an exceedingly powerful sorcerer on par with Doctor Strange, if not a little more powerful depending on what story you're reading. With the power cosmic, it's more of like, if I tap into that power and I use it, then what I'm doing is I'm admitting my power is not good enough. And of course, Dr. Doom, being as arrogant as he is, would not want to admit something like that. And so again, like Dr. Doom showing up here, facing off against Galactus, the idea behind here is, of course, Galactus is just like wanting to consume something, but he's not actually looking to consume the Earth. What he has here is like a need. Doom destroys basically like these little regulators for Galactus to kind of maintain his hunger. Suddenly is kind of Galactus in his most unbridled state, when Galactus has no restraint. And that's when we end up finding out that what he's locating or what he's looking for is Victorious, and of course, intending to feed on and consume her power cosmic. And that's kind of the crazy thing, because when the Fantastic Four start looking at this and Doom arrives on the scene, they're like, you've screwed up, you've miscalculated, whatever's going on here. Galactus is like seeking that power, but it's not Galactus as he normally functions, as he normally is. He goes from world to world, consuming the life energies of that world, but for whatever reason, he's going after her with the power cosmic she possesses. And it's kind of a cool little moment, because when that happens, what we get is kind of this reasonable drop of information. What we end up learning here is that in over the time that Victor Von Doom has existed in Latveria, and really, even after his first encounter with Galactus and the power he possessed, that as the king of Latveria, he will go to whatever means are necessary in order to preserve his people, but to also do what he thinks is the right thing to do. Now, just because he thinks it's the right thing to do does not mean it actually is. But what ended up happening here is what he needed, or at least what he wanted to do, was use Galactus as a power source. Now, this is not the first time someone's done this, right? Like we've seen that happen in Annihilation, when the forces of Annihilus and the Annihilation Wave seized Galactus and turned him into an energy source. We saw it in Thanos Imperative, when like an alternate reality version of Galactus was basically turned into like a giant engine capable of just like emitting and basically kind of blasting a huge amount of energy, right? Like the Galactus engine. With this scenario, is really Doom just intending to like use Galactus and all the power he possesses as an endless source of energy that can basically like power Latveria and presumably the world. But what he's been doing is building like these massive constructs that will siphon the power cosmic directly off Galactus. And that's why Victorious was given her powers, because he knew it would draw Galactus here. And so what's essentially happened here is Victor Von Doom siphoned a portion of the power cosmic off Galactus, gave it to Victorious, and then in turn Galactus is like, where's my portion of the power cosmic at? Who took this from me? And then tracked it down to Earth, and that's why he's here. It was basically a giant piece of bait. And so with Galactus being here, of course, then he begins the process of subduing him. And that's why I say, if you are not really familiar with like the various escapades where Galactus and Doom have faced off against each other, then it would kind of seem like it came out of nowhere. But again, referencing the old Secret Wars, it's happened. And so it's basically a way to make it work. And so with that going on, on, Galactus is actually subdued pretty quickly by the forces of Dr. Doom and is actually knocked into a coma. And when that happens, like he's just sort of there and just sort of comatose. But remember, he's a giant vector, I guess a giant siphon, kind of a gateway to the power cosmic, right? I mean, the nature of the power cosmic is that it's ambiguous. It's like the Enigma Force. It's just a source of power that exists and like only Galactus can really tap into it. But landing on Latveria Mountain, what this means is that it allows like all the forces of Victor Von Doom to begin like hooking up hoses and various siphoning devices and start drawing this energy off of Galactus. At the same time that happens, he also takes the Fantastic Four prisoner. And the idea behind this is to basically just like execute them publicly and to just say like, this is the power Victor Von Doom has, and this is why you should all like listen to me. On the surface, it kind of seems like it's a pretty thin plot, pretty basic, and almost a little nonsensical. It's actually not. It's a really great throwback to the old Stan Lee and Jack Kirby stories because these are the kind of stories that they made. And so of course, with him basically addressing the entirety of the world, you know, with these little TV orb things that he has and kind of calling it a day, saying like, I'm going to execute the Fantastic Four, they're all going to die. The world will no longer challenge the power of Dr. Doom. What this does is it allows the Fantastic Four to finally make their move. And the reason why is because at the end of the day, when it comes to Victor Von Doom, he always loses for one of two reasons. Either it's straight up because of his arrogance, that he like underestimates the foe he's facing, or he overestimates his power. And so in this instance, he underestimates the Fantastic Four. And again, like people would look at that and they would say, but he's faced them like a million times. Like, wouldn't he stop underestimating them and like estimate them accurately? Like, wouldn't he do that? But that was always the kink in Dr. Doom's armor, is that he was so full of arrogance and so full of hubris that he always believed he had the upper hand. But Reed Richards has always usually historically been shown to be smarter than Victor Von Doom. Now again, that fluctuates. The number one spot for the smartest person in the Marvel Universe usually fluctuates between Victor Von Doom, Reed Richards, and Reed's daughter Valeria Richards, right? It's usually kind of one of those three people who are taking that spot at any particular point in time. But this kind of says, hey, look, the one thing that you didn't account for is that like you haven't neutralized our powers. I mean, you have to a degree, but you've got Susan Storm held captive, but all she needs to do to be able to use her invisibility, for example, is to like have access to her mind. The only way to really defeat Susan Storm would be to put her in like a subdued state, right? Like put her in a catatonic state or something like that where her mind is shut down. And so what she ends up doing is basically using the one weakness Victor Von Doom has and revealing like his scarred face and his scarred body to the entirety of the world. Now again, that's one of the reasons why I love this, because you would look at that and you would say, okay, what does that have to do with anything? Well, remember, the one thing that Dr. Doom never wants anyone to see is what he actually looks like, right? Like that's his shame. His shame is like his face being as scarred as it is because he made it that way. He's almost like a fallen angel. And so with that happening, that of course takes away from him focusing on the scenario. He's taken away by Victorious, and then in turn Reed and company make their escape and they intend to go after Dr. Doom and basically face off against him, and things are done quite readily. He's defeated pretty fast. I mean, like Victorious is face off against by the Fantastic Four, they're defeated, and then of course like everything's pulled away from Galactus, and then like, you know, he begins to wake up, and that's when Dr. Doom makes his return and they all start facing off against each other. But when Galactus shows back up again, you know, he's like I'm free now. He strips power away from Victorious, who goes back to her normal self. He brings a power cosmic totally unto himself and then creates a kind of harness of sorts and then basically just sort of takes off, or at least that seems to be the indication that he ends up leaving. You know, as for Dr. Doom, what ends up happening here is he's actually met by a whole host of like demons, right? There's a reason for this. And we haven't really covered this little subsection of the story, but there's a reason for this. So while the Fantastic Four were traveling to Latveria and they were facing off against Dr. Doom, Franklin and Valeria were really wanting to like follow along, Franklin more than anybody else. And that's kind of one of the weird things that you see when it comes to the writing of his character, because at the end of Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four run, following like the future Franklin coming to the present day and then like defeating the Mad Celestials and that kind of stuff, that Reed Richards went through and started teaching his son how to use his powers. One of the things that kind of seems to get lost out of that, and even coming out of like Secret Wars, is like, yes, Franklin has his powers, but Reed won't let him do anything with them. And that's kind of one of the questions, is how can he possibly learn to use his powers effectively in like a combat situation if Reed never lets him use them? And so again, that's kind of the weird scenario that you run into with Franklin at the moment. But when he kind of gets frustrated and when he leaves, when he takes off, he suddenly comes across a girl named Wendy. Now, winding the clock back to 1982 with his run on the Fantastic Four in issue 239, I'm pretty sure it is, you ended up having this character, or really this concept called Wendy and Friends, that was introduced by John Byrne. And the way this played out was Wendy was a girl who lived in Benson, Arizona, and Benson, Arizona was one of several communities that was plagued by these demons that were called friends. And the reason why they were called friends is because Wendy referred to them as friends, and all we really had was the history she gave. But the way this would play out is every 10,000 years, these demons, more or less, these friends would basically show up in Benson, Arizona and the surrounding communities and judge the inhabitants, as to their worth of surviving by exposing them to like their inner darkness, right? Like their greatest fears and so on and so forth. And some would go crazy and kill others, and then some would just flee the area. But those individuals who could withstand that inner darkness were judged as being worthy, and those who weren't either died or ran away. But Wendy was the person who actually befriended the demons and just started calling them her friends. And so it's one of these things where like whenever they would show up, she was beyond reproach. Not only that, because they were friends, she could actually summon them. And so that's basically what happened here, right? Like Franklin Richards is a friend of Wendy who basically ends up traveling to Benson, Arizona from a dream sequence that he had. And she essentially invites him inside and says, hey, look, we can watch this whole thing unfold with the Fantastic Four and so on, which allows Franklin to somehow be a part of it. And then of course that leads to Wyatt Wingfoot tracking him down and finally locating him and saying, hey, we're taking you back home. And then Wendy freaks out and then just like unleashes all of her friends on Wyatt Wingfoot and Franklin Richards. And then that goes into like Valeria Richards creating a teleporter that brings all the demons directly to Dr. Doom. And so that's really where they come from. That aspect is really more of like the kiddie side, which I guess is okay, but we're talking about like a teenage version of Franklin and Valeria, right? So I mean, with Valeria being super smart, it is kind of weird to see her written as like a child who just, I guess really even Franklin having the power he has, being written as like a child who's just sort of young and goofy and that kind of a thing, as opposed to like really like a universal constant and somebody with power on par with Galactus. It is kind of weird to see it done that way. Again, it's really kind of taking the old 1960s style of storytelling and bringing it into the modern day. But again, it's kind of a cool little moment, kind of a cool little bit of storytelling. It's basically classic Fantastic Four, like 1960s Fantastic Four. Now, where this ends up going in is anybody's guess, because as we know with Dan Slott, when it comes down to like writing serious stories, Dan Slott can do that. Like he can write some pretty daggone serious stories. So I'm actually kind of excited to see where this goes. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.